Welcome back, ladies and gentlemen. Before we get in too far, I want to clarify the title. While I did have a little trouble getting absorbed in this book, the fever dream bit is more literal. I've been sick this past week. Between the cold and the NyQuil, my abilities of comprehension were lower than a politician being told they can't do something. That being said, I've taken a few stabs at this book, and since the act of reading has sent my head into spins over the last week, I figured it was a good idea to curl up with a nice audiobook and get through it. As a result, I've been through this book twice, and it wasn't just because of the sickness, or so I'd like to think. But before we get in too deep, a message from this video's sponsor, me. My series Battle Games has had its second book released recently. The second season of the world's most popular sport continues with the return of the team's captain, Giant Slayer, much to the bane of the vice captain, Harpy. If you're in the mood for some weirdness, colorful characters, and people beating each other with stun batons shaped like melee weapons, maybe give the series a try. I'll leave a link in the description. On to the review. Today we're reviewing Terry Pratchett's Wyrd Sisters, a name which was more than a nod at another work of fiction. This was definitely a standout in the Discworld series so far. So without further ado, let's get into the story, what I liked, what I didn't like, and my thoughts. The story. 3 witches have gathered for a coven in the Round Top Mountains, an area of the Discworld famous for producing witches and wizards. Of these 3, one is returning for a second time. Granny Weatherwax, then there's the family witch Nanny Ogg, and the young and dreamy Magret. They are currently engaged in a light argument disguised as a conversation. Meanwhile, in a nearby castle, the king stands up from falling down the stairs, only to discover his body didn't come with him. He has been assassinated by his cousin. Death regrettably informs this most kingly of kings that unfortunately he's fated to become a ghost. He is then rather stingy with the details of what this means. Death sticks around long enough to watch men loyal to the king disappear into the woods with his son. These men happen upon our coven of witches in time to give them the boy and the boy's father's crown, before shortly expiring of impromptu feathering. The pursuing duke's men then demand that the witches hand the boy over. The witches refuse, and the men, too stupid to realize you don't attack a witch in her own woods, do what men with swords do. They try to kill the witches. One of them is struck by a tree that was itself struck by lightning, and then seeing that his friend perished, the other man is convinced to leave. The witches are now faced with the dilemma of what to do with the child. After a bit of arguing, they go to a group of traveling mummers and give the child to the couple that runs the show. The couple names him Tom John, because why not, and the witches depart. This is where I'll leave off with the story. This book is a little longer than Pratchett's previous works, and while I went a little over 10% of the book, I tried to be as vague as I could with the details and just give you the general hook of the story. So let's get into what I liked. I think I've unintentionally discovered the Pratchett book formula without meaning to. You have your main characters going with the main plot. Then you have your funny side character doing a side plot that later links to the main plot. The side character is usually something animate that can't talk. This isn't all of his books, of course, but it's a lot of what I've read so far. In this case, the side character is a cat named Grebo, and one of the reasons I'm mentioning him as a like is because he's the epitome of a tomcat. I work and live in an area overrun with semi-domesticated felines, and this cat would fit in just fine with any of them. He is described as large, fat, mean, rapacious, smelly, and covered with so much scar tissue, his hair is merely garnish. When we are introduced to Grebo, we are told that at one time he gave a rather unfortunate surprise to a she-bear, which, if you've lived around feral cats long enough, you'll know that's not too far out of the common. His entire story arc involves him going to the castle because the queen got a new white she-cat, and he ends up getting locked in a room and making his witch worried. This is because cats are able to see ghosts, and the ghost of the former king needs a way to lure a witch into his castle. Sadly, the fact that a very minor character was a major like and purely for his familiarity is not really a good sign. But I've got a few more things to get to before my dislikes. The interplay between the three witches was entertaining and relatable. Maybe this comes from being raised predominantly by old Southern women, but the argument and discussions of the witches felt very familiar. Granny Weatherwax is snippy and a little condescending and has an almost angry nature. Nanny Ogg has a more nurturing feel and she has a ridiculously large family. And then there's the harebrained Margaret, who I think is the youngest of the group. Well, she's obviously the youngest of the group, but all of these felt like family members, people that I know in my own life. The best example I can give of the interplay between these witches that I enjoyed was when Margaret took the other two witches to see a play for the first time. This is when they were trying to find someone to take the child. Both Granny Weatherwax and Nanny Ogg were unable to tell that it was a work of fiction and continued to behave in a way that would make you ask for a refund if they were present at your theater. But in this world, something like that would be poor form, and it's generally stupid to insult a witch. As with any of Pratchett's books that deal with witches, I appreciate the balance of magic. While wizards are supposed to be the top of the magical field, the witches are the unstandardized local equivalent. They're kind of like that crazy friend you know that can do too many odd things with computers or cars. They know more than they should, but lack the funds and information to make something that's truly dangerous. Most of the time, the witches don't even use magic, just the vague suggestion that they might. And I like this in spellcasters. A lot of subtlety is missed in most fiction with magic. In this book, even when the witches use magic, it feels more indirect and honestly more magical. The witch doesn't throw lightning from her hands. She calls it from the sky. She doesn't turn you directly into a frog. You have to go home and go to bed first. Then you wake up in the morning as something else. This feels more like magic than throwing fireballs and making things appear out of nowhere. It also makes the stakes higher for the caster, as they just can't blow things up and have to use their wits more often than magic. It also leads to moments where you're not sure if magic was used or not. Lastly, the book was funny. This feels like one of those things you shouldn't have to mention about a Terry Pratchett book. But modernity has taught me something different, as I never thought someone would try to insert Valley Girl speak into a fantasy book until I read the Fourth Wing series, and so here we are. On to my dislikes. Maybe it's because I was sick, or maybe it was the medicine I was taking, but this book doesn't flow very well. It's a bit too spread out, a bit too much is going on, or it might simply not be transitioning well. That's not to say I couldn't follow what was going on. It's more like what some anime do. You're in the middle of an exciting fight or some traumatic scene, you're just getting to the good part, then bam! 10-episode flashback of something that's only mildly related. I think this is more a problem of having too many important characters in one story. To list them out, we have Granny Weatherwax, Nanny Ogg, Margaret, the Fool, the King's Ghost, the Duke, the Duke's Wife, Tom John, Tom John's dad, and the Playwright. I'm not covering more minor characters that may be in just one scene. And on top of that, you also have Death and Grebo. It's a lot of characters to jump between and made the story not exactly confusing, but a bit more work than I liked. That being said, I think Pratchett was trying to do an homage to Shakespeare, as the story feels like a very loose Macbeth with a touch of Hamlet. I didn't much care for either story when I read them in high school, but then I've always felt a bit distant with Shakespeare. I've read a number of his stories, and I know, at least as far as I've been taught, why he's important and why he's a good storyteller, but I've never been able to get into his work. I also don't remember it very well, as it was over 20 years ago. On to my thoughts. There is a love plot between Margaret and the Fool that kinda falls flat. I can't count this as a dislike, but it neither entertained or annoyed me. Margaret is an endearing airhead. She's got the young and naive thing down, The fool has a similar tragic past to most comedians. That being, they went through a life that was profoundly not funny to get where they are. He's from a long line of fools, and his schooling on the subject feels very brutalist with a shade of darkness thrown in. But the chemistry between the two is lacking. They're a bit like the most uninteresting couple you know, which is disappointing as a romance between a fool and a witch has distinct possibilities. There's an interesting theme that's brought out about Discworld in this book, about how the small communities the witches serve view them. Witches in the Discworld fill a midwife, medicine woman, and village elder role. They're both vital and mysterious, which is a good place to put them. When the Duke tries to round them up for tax evasion, typical politician's ploy, no one will turn against them. Even the soldiers the Duke sends are turned away with nothing but a pastry and a pat on the back. The people the witches service are both proud and terrified of the witches in their midst. I think this is a fantastic bit of world building, but I'm not sure I can entirely put this in my likes for this book. I do like it as a world building element and how it fits in. I really don't know how to rate this book. I did enjoy much of it as individual parts, but the story feels lacking. In the book, the dwarf playwright Huel has a problem with this big play he's writing, which is actually the events of Tom John's father's death. His big problem is that even though all the parts for a great story are there, no one really likes the play. That's kind of like this book. All the parts for a great story are there, but they end up being less than the sum of their parts. That said, this is still a Pratchett book, and it's still an amusing read. And so I will leave you all with that and go sink back into my NyQuil haze. Good luck, everyone.